topic for today, I was given, is policy advice, advising leaders. And so I borrowed the famous phrase from Aaron Nodosky that essentially it's speaking truth to power. So he was speaking particularly the role of civil servants in this task. But in general, the notion of the policy advisor is someone who speaks truth to power, implying also that this perhaps needs to be a fearless job as well. Now, that assumes several things. First of all, it assumes that the policy advisor has the truth, that he or she, in fact, is capable of supplying real answers to real problems for the policymaker. And as I'll try to point out in several points along this morning, that's often a very happy assumption that's false. That a lot of times policy advice, even the best policy advice, is informed guesswork. But the best, what one has to do is to do one's best. And the second part of this is the assumption that the power wants to hear. So you have to assume that there is, in fact, a market or an interest in policy advice. And so when one speaks truth to power, power merely ignores it or dismisses you or whatever. So there's an assumption then, and one of the reasons for per se, particularly ideology, assumption that somehow we know the answers in advance, and that we don't need to be that worried about analysis. Ideology, simple pig-headedness, a variety of different reasons for not being particularly interested in hearing what someone else has to say. But in that, so we need then to think about the content of advice, the actors, and the structuring of advice. So how is the best way, in fact, to structure a process of giving advice to leaders? Now, and again, hopefully you will interrupt and have things to say. What? I haven't got anything up there yet. That's why.
Okay. Be patient.
Is that better? No.
I thought that was on purpose.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
As you can see, I have limited technical ability. And I'll never give it policy advice about IT and so forth. So, anyway, so where were we? Yes. Now, one way to think, to sort of frame this notion then of policy advice is to think about a notion of policy design. Now, particularly, coming as I do from an Anglo-American tradition, we tend to think about policy somewhat more incrementally, as almost evolutionary, rather than in design terms. And that in many systems, too, there's been some sort of political reaction against the notion of planning, big schemes, large-scale ex-ante policy devising. Part of that is neoliberalism, that the assumption that the market can take care of most problems and that things are better off if the state stays out of them. And to some extent, too, it's the post-communist reaction, as we talked about yesterday, against centralization, big schemes, large government programs. So the notion then of policy design, to some extent, again, probably particularly in the Anglo-American culture, is not particularly well received. Okay, that having been said, there is this need then for some sort of systematic analysis of policy, and to think about it in design terms. That is, to think about it in the way of a conscious design process, much as if one was an architect or an engineer, because you've got, to some extent, the same sort of task in policy analysis and policy advice of building such a workable device. So rather than it being an automobile, it's a policy. Now, and what do we need to do to design? And advice is involved here. And this is particularly important since most policy analysis and most policy advice is ex ante. That is, you're doing things before the fact. And literally going out of the house to come here, I remember this wonderful piece that I don't have on the slide, so I'll just talk about it a bit, by Henry Aaron. It was his presidential address when he was the president of the Association of Public Policy Analysis and Management, EPAN, which is sort of the major policy analysis group in the U.S. And one interesting sidelight, for any of you who are baseball fans, I doubt there aren't many, that the two major economists at the Brookings Institution for a long period of time were Henry Aaron and Bob Feller. Okay, total blank. Henry Aaron is the greatest home run hitter ever, and Bob Feller was a Hall of Fame pitcher. So these weren't the same guys, but they had these names. It was just one of these wonderful circumstances. Anyway, that's totally irrelevant. Now, but Aaron's presidential address was entitled "Seeing Through the Fog: Policy Making in Uncertain Environments." So his notion is that essentially that any sort of policy making, to some extent any sort of policy advice, is an attempt to see through the fog of the future. And we do ourselves a disservice if we think we're doing anything else. If we think, in fact, that we're too certain about things. Now, I'll come back to this in a moment, because your client here, your advisee, often wants certainty, often demands certainty. They want to know the answers because they've got to put their political careers on the line and put a lot of public money on the line. They, in fact, usually want certainty. There's this famous statement by Harry Truman when he was president of the United States that he wanted to hire a one-armed economist, because all his economists kept telling him, on the one hand this, but on the other hand that. And he wanted an economist who only had one hand, who wouldn't give him this sort of contradictory advice. And so many policy leaders then don't want to think about the degree of uncertainty with which they're faced. But to some extent, then it's the job of the analyst to remind him or her that, in fact, they are dealing with a great deal of uncertainty. So Aaron said that policies, if I quote, all public policies have two things in common. They deal with the future, and therefore they deal with uncertainty. And they deal with forecasting. So that inevitably one then is making forecasts about the future. Not only particularly about the state of nature in which one is going to be, but then also about even the social dynamics that may be involved in that state of nature. So he therefore argued that essentially four things one needed to do in policy analysis. First, it's important to appreciate that most projections are wrong. So most of the time when we make projections about the future, we're going to be wrong. Sorry for any of you who are futurologists, but the odds are you're going to be wrong. And often, as he says, wildly wrong. A few things you can predict pretty well. Demography. You know how many children are going to be born, so hence you know how many children will need schooling 5 or 6 years hence, assuming normal rates of mortality. So a few things like that you can predict, but a lot of things you can't. Secondly, he argues that it's important not to permit forecast to give you false certainty. So, and if you look in any national budget, for example, what you'll find a nice forecast for future economic circumstances, most of which, again, are wildly wrong and usually biased. They're always excessively optimistic. So the rate of economic growth is always going to be higher than it actually is. The rate of unemployment is always going to be lower than it actually is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So most forecasts are not only wrong, they're biased. And therefore, and presidents and prime ministers, parliaments want, to some extent, the biased forecast. Because if economic growth is higher and unemployment's lower, inflation is lower, then they've got more money to spend. Spending's always easy, constraints always hard. So politically, you want these biased forecasts. You want happy news to be able to give to your constituents. So, I mean, one of the clearest examples of this is our own beloved president, who had these wonderful forecasts about the impact of tax cuts on the economy. That somehow that you cut taxes, then you're going to have massive growth, and so there won't be the $100 billion deficit that there is this year. Very happy news, and he found economists who would come up with the numbers for him, and went off and made his policies. Okay, thirdly, all this uncertainty means that it's important to build policies that are flexible. And again, if we go back to something I was talking about yesterday, politically, that's hard to do. Politically, you typically have to tell your client that what you are doing then is the answer. And secondly, he or she's got to tell the Parliament or the public or both that this is the answer. Uncertainty is hard to take politically. But uncertainty is a fundamental reality of policymaking. So one then has to then design, insofar as possible, policies that are flexible. Now, not all policies are equal in terms of their flexibility. Not all types of policies are equal in terms of their flexibility. Say even within social policy. Contrast direct social benefits for the unemployed and the poor to pensions. Now, the programs that you design for the poor, for the unemployed, you can make flexible. Because essentially people are moving in and out. It's a relatively short-term type of consequence, or short-term program. So that it's essentially month by month or even week by week in terms of the benefits, the number of applicants, the need to pay. Pensions, however, are a stock program. Once you make a commitment to a pension program, transition to another type of program is very, very difficult. So right now, most industrial democracies, indeed many countries in the world, all full stop, are facing the problem of an aging population, a relatively small and getting smaller working age population. Pension schemes essentially have been a direct intergenerational transfer. That is, most people think that the money they pay in for their pension somehow goes into a bank somewhere and is earning interest, etc., etc. In most cases, it's merely going out the back door to the people who are already on pensions. So it's a direct intergenerational transfer. So you're faced with this problem of not having fewer people working, more people receiving pensions. Therefore, you either have to cut the size of the pension, raise the taxes on the working population, or something else creative. No one's yet quite come up with what something else creative is. But now, so the point is that here, though, is that that the pensioners have been paying into the pension program 30, 40 years of their working life. So making a transition for them is virtually impossible. If they had been told 30 or 40 years ago, to start investing, that you can to begin to privatize pensions 30 or 40 years ago, that's fine, you can do that. But you can't make these types of changes now for them. Likewise, it's hard to make the change even for people of your age who are going to be paying for me, thank you. So that, because then you'd have to essentially pay double. You'd have to pay for me in my generation because essentially the commitment's been made, but then you'd also have to invest for your own future in some sort of privatized scheme if governments want to transition out of the current system. So here's a program that in many ways doesn't lack certainty. We know about how many old people there are going to be. We know pretty well how many working age people there are going to be. The problem is that the numbers don't match. But this being this long-term stock type of program, flexibility now is not really very much of an option without reneging on some fundamental obligations and fundamental commitments that have been made. So not all programs are equal in terms of how one can build in flexibility. And then the final point that Aaron makes is that when flexibility is impossible, at least be honest about it, take it into account, try to come up with alternative scenarios, etc., etc. But I think one of the important things, again, is to think about the uncertainty that's involved here. Now, another way to think about this problem, again, this is an attempt to make the point about the differences that may exist among programs. Now, for some types of programs, you have a fairly good notion about causation. You have a fairly good notion about what causes things to happen, and what's the basic dynamic of the program. For others, you don't. For some, you have a great deal of information. Others, you don't. And policy making, therefore policy advice, to some extent has to be different in these different types of programs. So what would an example then of a routine program be? Yeah, okay, that defines it, but name a program that would fit that characterization. Well, in pensions in some ways is better, for a reason I'll point out in a moment. Pensions, the knowledge of causation, the knowledge of how you actually run the program is very easy. You write checks. So the technology for pensions is very, very simple. You simply turn on your check writing machine and spit out checks. And likewise, the information is very high. You know how many eligible people they are. So, yeah.
But for pensions, you don't know how long they are going to live exactly. But for schooling, you know how long they will be in school generally.
You do know how long they'll be in school, but do we know how education as a process works?
Not at that specific time.
Yeah. That was the uncertainty that I wanted to get at there, is that the methodology, we have a methodology that we use, we've been using just what we're doing today. That we've been doing since God knows when. But no one really, does this really work the best? We're accustomed to it. That's perhaps the point I was trying to get to there. But I take your point about not knowing about the demography and that aspect of it changing. Fair enough. Okay, another way to think about this too, on the information side, is how variable is the raw material. Okay, so for a lot of public programs, the raw material is people. And people are highly variable. So if you're thinking about, education as a process, and the raw material for the process being students, some students are bright, and some we know aren't. And so you then have to think about how you deal with that variability. Where do you peg the classes? How do you differentiate among the bright and the less bright, while maintaining a certain amount of political correctness in the process? So forth. So another way to think about this information constraint on the side of the table is to think just how variable the raw materials are. Now, again, for my pensioners, even though they're variable, some elderly people are cranky and some aren't and so forth, and healthier or less healthy, for pensions, that doesn't really matter. What really matters simply is for the most part, is their eligibility. If they're over the age, if they paid their contributions, then it's a fairly simple type of determination for eligibility. So the raw material in some ways isn't that variable. Now, so that's a routine program. What's a creative program? Low. You don't know much, and you don't know social causation or models of causation.
Social benefits?
Social benefits, or say something like really trying to deal with social exclusion, poverty. So the current phrase I think the EU uses now is social exclusion, and meaning not just poverty, but meaning a whole range of other types of social exclusions, that you're essentially cut off from a whole range of social activities that the normal citizen would expect to be involved in. Community activities, simply in many cases family life for the homeless and so forth. And so that type of program, trying to deal with fundamental problems of deprivation and exclusion, is probably in the low. Knowledge of, not to belabor this point, but say high levels of knowledge, but low levels of information. That's the harder one, actually.
Private issues such as sexually transmitted disease. Sexually transmitted disease prevention programs.
It could.
Knowledge.
You know how it happens, yeah.
You don't have information because it's private. Here you can't.
It's private, but then also you don't know why people engage in risky behaviors. In many cases.
Here you do, but you don't get it in English. You don't get it back. You don't have the information.
Well, maybe, in fact, too, smoking. If we go back to yesterday's discussions, that it's hard for anybody to know that this is not a risky behavior. At the same time, large portions of the population still engage in it. And why? And then the final one, the conditional, high levels of information, low levels of causation. Probably is education, to go back to that. That again, you've got a highly variable raw material, but you know how many kids are going to be there, so forth. You can fill in the blanks any way you want. But part of the logic here, again, is to remember that when one's making these types of advice to the powerful, that programs and policies themselves are highly variable. Now, let me go a lot back to what I thought was the main line of argument here. Where's that slide? So I got off on that point because of the fact that all these programs are ex ante, or most policy advice rather, is ex ante involving foresight. But for design, arguably one needs three things: a model of causation, a model of instrumentation, and a model of evaluation. Now, first of all, this model of causation, again, going back to this last slide, how do things happen? What's the underlying dynamic of the problem? So if we go back to the issue, or whatever you're trying to do. So if we go back to my example yesterday from Nelson, the moon and the ghetto, there the underlying model of causation was pretty well known. Basic physics, basic engineering. So you could do all the calculations, you just needed the big enough computers to do it, and big enough rockets to make it work. So the model of causation there was fairly clear. Again, the model for social deprivation, many other types of social activities, our knowledge of causation is much more limited. And likewise, the model often has to be constructed. And so in many cases, these problems are socially constructed as problems. And are political choices. So to some extent, policy advice and then policy choice is making a choice often among alternative models of causation. Example, illicit drug policies. What's the model of crime? Let's take crime. Why do we have criminality? One answer is social deprivation. People are poor, so they steal. And engage in other illegal activities simply because they're deprived and are trying to make their way in the world. Second answer would be families. Children are raised poorly, or they're raised in abusive situations, and therefore take out their frustrations from family life in society. There are some genetic models of crime that, particularly males who have an extra X chromosome, are like 10 times more likely to become criminal, particularly violent criminals, than are other males. So we could do genetic screening and lock up all these people as soon as they're born and prevent a lot of crime. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just pointing this out. So you have alternative models then of causation. So policy advice and then policy selection is, first of all, choosing one of these notions about causation. And doing that then is going to determine how are you going to intervene. So if crime is caused by social deprivation, you begin to try to create greater social equality. If it's caused by family life, you try to intervene there. If it's caused by genetics, then again you lock them up. But
I have a question.
Sure.
Where from do you get the data in order to consider that where there's a high, well, for instance, that you have your hypothesis that you begin with, it's actually one term is caused by the other one, so you have a very high idea conditional. I mean, for instance, you said things about the crime.
Yeah.
You have less education, or I don't know, you were raised in poor conditions, that you are more inclined to behave in a criminal manner. Where do you gather the data as to, I don't know, consider that this position really exists as for you to afterwards design the policy making? So do you rely on the already scientific research made over that one? You just rely on intuition? You just rely on
the answer is all the above. Now that in some cases you do try to use the available scientific evidence. And there's certainly a lot of it around. But again, often you wind up with the two-armed economist, because a lot of the scientific evidence will cut different ways. Okay. Often it may be intuitive, or more than intuitive, often this model of causation is political and ideological.
Yeah, which brings me to the next question. If you are an analyst, for instance, and you are asked to do some research at this matter or to make a proposal for a policy, and you know that the person that asked for that particular analysis has a very clear idea of what the research would be all about at the end, then it is the problem that I see that brings between choosing to give the argument in the manner that your client actually, wanted, or providing this two-fold, analysis, being a little bit more uncertain, but being at the same time more, keeping this honesty in research. So the problem is how to be in the same time the policy maker, some advisor that it's all the time requested to give advice, and at the same time trying to keep the uncertainty that, as a researcher and a social scientist, you may want to deny.
Basic problem.
Yeah.
And it's one that every individual has to decide for him or herself. Just how much intellectual dishonesty you can take to keep your job. But on the other hand, there's a question too of whether you're serving the client if you're not giving him or her what they want. Now, so presumably though, you wouldn't go into working for a government if you could avoid it that you disagreed with fundamentally. Okay. Secondly, often there are alternative sources of advice, so that one can still be honest, or I should say alternative ways in which to do the analysis, or alternative analyst. So it's a fundamental value choice. And it's more of a choice than for civil servants, who presumably want to have a permanent career, but then are faced with changing governments. So one model, of course, has been the notion that a good civil servant can serve any master. It's his or her job not to impose their own values on the... Now, there's a difference between imposing values and imposing reality. Now, but the two are hard to distinguish, because to some extent our realities are shaped by our values. It's a very postmodernist sort of position there. But how you're going to shape the data, what data you're going to read, how you're going to read it, is to some extent shaped by values. Now, so is the good civil servant then one who can serve any political master? Or does he or she have to remain true to what they want, or what they believe, or think is right, resign, refuse, whatever? And I think, and arguably that's a question of how much tolerance individually you have, what the nature of the system is, and what alternatives you have. So, for example, go ahead.
That goes back to which is the basic point about whether you come in, assuming you already know what the policy you want to come out is, or you come in and you take the available data and see what the story that's told by the data is. One of the things that we do a lot of data-driven work, and in one state they said, well, people here...
Who's we?
We, NCHEMS, the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems in the United States. We're a private nonprofit, just like the name. So we'll be in a state gathering all the data to show them kind of what's going on educationally with the post-secondary. And people will say, well, people just don't value higher education in this state. They just won't go to college. And so we'll say, okay, well, I might not know all the data here. What can you show me on that? What data is available? I'm even willing to look at newspaper polls or something like that. But most of the time, people can't come up with any actual data to show that. So that's kind of how I go about it, and then I can take into account that, well, I did look for this, but didn't find any evidence of it. So if they want to start doing polls and stuff to show that people don't appreciate higher education, they do that. Now, other states have been able to show that by showing how often they voted down bond issues and stuff for post-secondary. So that's how I've done it.
But I think a good example of that on education, it was on the debate that's been going on in charter schools.
It's both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Both sides are shaping the evidence to suit themselves and using the same evidence and simply reading it differently. So, all the way through here, that although we talk about this analysis as somehow being scientific and value-free and et cetera, it really isn't. One can attempt to be as scientific as possible, but ultimately one's own ideas and beliefs, political values, and so forth are probably going to be involved. And then you've got to have the question about how do you serve your master? Or can you serve your master or your client? It's really a basic ethical question. No nice, neat answer, like most good questions. Anything else on that? Okay, so we've got a model of causation, again, which is to some extent intellectually and to some extent politically biased, perhaps. Okay. Secondly, you've got a model of instrumentation. How are you going to intervene? And government has a massive tool chest. Chris Hood's classic book on the tools of government, so it gave us this metaphor. The governments have tools with which they want to intervene. Say, for example, we want to, I keep harping on this, I don't know why, but we want to stop people smoking. So you've decided that a major national priority should be stopping people smoking. How can you do it?
Campaign for education.
Oh, okay, education. Okay.
Prizes.
Okay.
Prison all the smokers.
Okay. Well, Hood talked. Listen. Okay. Hood talked about 4 fundamental tools for dealing with public problems that have the acronym NATO. They have nothing to do with defense, but nodality of. So nodality is information, essentially. That government's a major information node, both in terms of taking in information and disseminating it. So the first thing y'all came up with was a campaign, making information available, making people know the harms, the dangers of smoking. So advertising, campaigning, etc. So that's nodality. Authority is law. So what do? You imprison the smokers, right? In the sort of severe version here. Or you forbid smoking in all public places. And you make people have to go outside to smoke. And there was a wonderful picture in the papers in the States this winter of the northern territories in Alaska and Canada, Nunavik, the new area that's been created for indigenous populations, just passed an anti-smoking law in public buildings, meaning then that you have to go outside in temperatures about 40 below to smoke, which is close to imprisoning. So anyway, so you use law. You regulate smoking. You regulate so you can't buy cigarettes until you're 18 or 20 or 21 or 74 or whatever. So you use law as a means of controlling. especially in pubs. Treasure is money. So you can, as someone said a moment ago here, tax. You can raise the prices of cigarettes to a point where it becomes prohibitive, or at least difficult. Problem is, you have a real then redistributional question, because we know that from scientific evidence that the majority of smokers are in working class, or particularly lower working class. So you essentially are then imposing a massive negative redistribution on the society through this tax. Okay, but we can think more positively. Instead of imposing penalties, imprisoning, or taxing, if you stop smoking, you can verify it for 6 months, you get a free vacation. Government will give you 1 week on the beach somewhere. Why not?
What are the guarantees that actually after you get your week free, you will not start again so as to get another week free?
That wouldn't be hard to design. You're entitled to this once in your life, period. You can design it, the program, even for devious people such as yourself. But and then finally, organization. So you can have sort of government hall monitors. You can have people walking around the street saying, no, you're smoking. You're a naughty person. But governments have lots of people. They have lots of employees. They can use this organizational solution. Now the point is here, I mean, you can take almost any public problem and think about how to deal with it. But the notion is that governments have lots of options for design of instruments, but the choice of instruments have got some consequences. And lots of different types of consequences. Some of the consequences are economic. So the example I was just saying, that if we have this negative redistribution, you're having essentially a negative economic impact on the society, potentially, through the particular instrument you chose. Likewise, you've got political problems. Imprisoning the smokers, most people would regard as being rather apolitical, is probably going too far for most people's politics, and hence that sort of draconian intervention is likely to produce political problems for the government that introduced it.
Maybe economic problems as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you imprison the smokers, you will imprison a big part of working class, so who will work?
You force them to work in jail.
I was about to say you make them work in jail for much lower wages. I think we've come up with a solution to the national economic problem. But anyway. Then you've got administrative problems. Some programs are more difficult to administer than are others. So, for example, if you want to use organization as a weapon, if you want to use the organizational tool to get at things, you've got to hire people. That's expensive. On the other hand, if you're using information and advertising, for the most part, it's pretty cheap. So you simply put up signs, or you get free time on television to tell people to do this, do that, don't do the other, so forth. It's very, very cheap, and often as effective. Then finally, you may have ethical questions. Let's go back to our pensioners. So for the most part, we treat pensioners as if they're responsible adults. You give them a check every month, and they go off and do what they want. So we assume that they're going to pay the rent, buy good food, do all the right things. But they can take the money and simply buy cigarettes, booze, and gamble. And starve themselves. Now, presume we want to make sure that Granny takes care of herself, rather than spending all her time at the track gambling. We can force her, instead of giving her a check, The first step you do is give her half the check in vouchers that are good only for food. And not only food, but good food. I mean, you can't buy potato chips with it. You've got to buy broccoli. And so forth. So again, but is that ethical to treat an adult in that sort of controlling in loco parentis type of manner? So instruments, along with the choice of the basic logic of causation, have these types of political and ethical issues that are involved in them as well. And then finally, one needs a model of evaluation. So the third element of design is evaluation. What is a good policy? And again, you've got all these characteristics running through as well. Economics. What are the economic consequences of the policy? What are the political consequences? Do I get reelected? What are the ethical consequences? So you have to decide how you want to evaluate. I mean, typically, the standard model of evaluation for public policies are economic, cost-benefit analysis. Does the program create a net economic benefit to society? But there are these other alternatives as well. But if you look at what's going on in most governments, the standard mode of analysis is some version of cost-benefit, benefit-cost type of analysis, largely based on economic efficiency. Okay, so the notion then of advice is that one's making advice in order to design policies with these characteristics in them. A notion about what's causing the problem, how do you deal with the problem, and what is good solution. So that's your job as the analyst, is to provide that for your client. Not an easy task by any means. But even to some extent assumes several other prior things. First of all, how do you get the problem on the agenda? So one of your major tasks as an analyst, as an advisor, is how to get the issues that your person wants onto the agenda. If you can't have something agendized, again, another horrible word, but one that's used, if you can't have something agendized, then you can't deal with it. Now, and sometimes problems then, again, have to be constructed. Yeah?
So this is the job of the policy advisor? Shouldn't it be the job of the politician to get an agenda?
No, but part of the job of the policy advisor is, I'm a politician, you're my advisor. And I say, I think something's wrong here. Let's use a real example. Spousal abuse. For much of the history of society, spousal abuse wasn't considered a political problem, or a policy problem. That spouses beat each other up. And that was simply the nature of married life. Or at least for some portion of the population. And it turns out that about as many women beat up their husbands as husbands beat up women. At least in some places. Anyway. Not quite as many, I shouldn't say. But this notion of spousal abuse, then...
Statistically, that's not fair.
But I
It's not true, no.
I should have said, I know, more than you would expect.
Okay.
That's what I should have said. Yeah. More than you would expect. You're absolutely right. But anyway. But again, that wasn't a public problem. So I, as the politician, ask you, my advisor, okay, my friend, how do I make this a public... I think this is wrong. How do we deal with it? How do I move this out of the realm of the private into the realm of the public? And it's your task to help me. So yeah, it is a part of the analysis. So problem construction is in many ways probably the crucial part of policy analysis. What is the problem? Essentially, and what's the causation that goes with it? So public problems don't come, it's not Christmas morning. They're not under the tree with labels on them. You've got to make the problems. And again, a major part of the job of the analyst and a major job of the policy entrepreneur is making the problem. And then secondly, in Kingdom's terms, making the window of opportunity. So that sometimes, no matter how opportune or how pressing or real the problem may be, there may not be an opportunity. So often you need a focusing event, often a fairly dramatic focusing event, in order to open a window of opportunity for this new policy. So yes, I'm sorry, but it is part of your job.
Yeah, it's just, I guess, if you have a notion of more scientific policy advice, then maybe you would come in later in the process.
Yeah.
It's like public relations, you start earlier, then it's more political job.
Yeah. Well, Alan Meltzner, one of the people who study policy advice or written about it, said that policy analysts who only do what you're talking about, who are only scientific, are quote-unquote baby analyst. Nothing personal. That essentially aren't grown up yet. You've got to grow up and understand that you're always dealing in a political world. So until you can deal without that politics, your effectiveness really is limited. You can come in with a lot of facts. But until you involve yourself more in the political world, you're not really doing your job as the analyst. Yeah.
Well, I think the solution would be a little bit in between. As a policy advisor, you could come up with a true, if this is possible, argumentation, but also give to this politician a set of lines of argumentation that could be used in this specific political setting in order to get it on the agenda.
Sure.
Would be acceptable for the other people in the coalition, for instance.
Yeah. A good analyst has to do both.
But you cannot be the one really trying to get it on the agenda yourself.
No, you can't do it yourself, but you've got to help them do it. That's all I was saying. You've got to give them the lines. So you've got to understand the political process as well as understanding the data.
Yes, and find some cases.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Should we make a difference between policy advice of civil servants and policy advice of political staff?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. But even civil servants. Oops. So historically and even in present time, in many cases, that ministers have a relatively small political staff. Civil servants have to do this task as well. It's perfectly appropriate for a minister to ask a civil servant, saying, I want to do this, how do I do it? I want to get this issue on the agenda. This is part of my political task. You help me do it. That's perfectly appropriate. Of course, it's less appropriate for that minister to say, okay, I want to get reelected. You help me do that. Now, those are different requests. The fact that you make good policy may help the minister get reelected, but it's indirect, as opposed to direct political involvement. But it's perfectly appropriate for the minister to ask you, as a civil servant, presumably in most cases you as the civil servant have had more experience. You know better in some ways how these things have worked in the past. You can advise the minister not only about the content of the policy, but the political dynamics of it. And so clearly there's a line somewhere. But that line is not very clear. It's a very fuzzy line. And to some extent, to go back to the question over here, each civil servant has to decide where that line is for him or her. How far they're willing to go politically. And sometimes they get burned by it. Sir Robert Armstrong, classic case, was much too close to the Heath government. And the phrase that was used was he was a moth who flew too close to the flame. And essentially had to, in the end, quit because he'd become politically tainted. Again, there are different lines for that. Yeah.
He was PM
Yeah.
Permanent Secretary.
Yeah. Permanent Secretary of the Cabinet. Yeah. No, it was career civil service, but yeah. But this is also then. But this is the point that I'll get to later on. I'm moving along, if we have time. But part of the relationship here with the policy analyst and the minister is personal. I mean, we've been talking about this to some extent analytically and scientifically, all those wonderful terms. But a lot of this is personal, and a lot of it's trust. So, does the minister trust me as an analyst or not? And do I trust the minister to do the right thing with what I tell him or her? So this relationship is career, is bureaucratic, etc., etc., etc. But a lot of times it comes down to personal interactions as well. As some ministers work better with some civil servants, with some analysts, than they do with others. And some analysts work better with some ministers than they do with others. And a lot of, again, it is interpersonal, trust-based, so forth.
Doesn't it also depend on the culture of the country? Because in some countries, political liaisons are much more acceptable than in others. For instance, British civil service is traditionally extremely apolitical.
Neutral, yeah.
But in the United States, it's sometimes can be quite political. Am I right?
Yes and no. The civil service is apolitical. And radically so, even more so than the British. I'll come back to that in a moment. But then there are many more political appointees who would hold posts that would normally be civil service in other systems. So when George W. became president, he brought in about 4,500 political appointees. And that's just not him. I mean, 4,500 Democrats left. So there are that many political appointees on top of the career civil service. Now, the career civil service itself, for the most part, is extremely apolitical. And in fact, are legally prohibited from all sorts of political actions, so-called Hatch Acts. So until the early 1990s, civil servants were forbidden any political action except voting. I mean, they couldn't wear signs or buttons. They couldn't put yard signs in the yard. They couldn't engage in political campaigns. They couldn't give money to parties, etc., etc., etc. And both federal and state. My favorite story on this: when I lived in Michigan, the governor of Michigan was G. Minnan Williams, and his political symbol was a polka-dotted green bow tie. So every day he wore a bow tie that was green with white polka dots. Not exactly a fashion statement, but that was Soapy. His nickname was Soapy Williams. I thought. So every day. So one day, a Michigan civil servant showed up in the office wearing a green and white polka dot bow tie, and was sent home to change, because that was a political symbol. So it went to extremes at times. So the career civil service is very apolitical. But again, you've got this very large number of political appointees. But your basic point's quite correct, that the political nature of the civil service varies to a great extent. So Germany, the upper tiers are essentially political and career. So the Staatssekretär and the lower and down tend to change when there's a change in government. But they aren't. Unlike ours, who simply have to go find a job in the private sector, they are simply put on temporary retirement. So they remain civil servants. Okay. Okay. Now where was I? Yeah. Okay, moving right along here. And they tend, it's good that they don't change. Why?
I mean, if they do stick to their opinions, even though they lost their either seat in the Congress or then maybe this can be considered as a good point because they will probably try to strengthen their position, try to look further into making good remarks to debate as to verify their points. Because I do believe that, well, of course you can have a revelation and just discover that you are not fighting for the good.
Yeah.
But I think this is just merely something that may happen, but it's rather...
Okay. Yeah, but the interesting thing, of course, is how more... I mean, I don't want to turn this into a seminar on American politics, but just one point is that how much more ideologically divided the parties are now than historically they have been. So that it was, for most of our history, party didn't mean much of anything. Now it does. So now there are these much more ideological parties, much less, in fact, comity between them. So it's really become much more polarized than in the past.
And just one maybe last point. You pointed out that the Heritage Foundation and American Enterprise Institute are Republican government in exile. But maintaining such institutions and maintaining all these 4,500 people in jobs costs a lot of money. How does it? Is it covered? Is it partially by the subsidy for the political parties?
No. There is no subsidy for political parties. Not for the parties. They are for the elections, but not for the parties.
Because in Germany, model is that there are subsidies for political parties.
Yeah, but not for the parties. No, it's all private contribution. Or then, particularly the Brookings makes a lot of money off publications. But the majority of the money is endowment, original endowments to the foundations and continuing contributions. So the major donor to the Heritage Foundation now is Joseph Coors, the brewery. So every time you drink a Coors beer, you're helping the far right of the Republican Party.
Running for Republican Senate.
Colorado, yeah. So essentially, the people on the left give money to Brookings, more those on the right give money to AEI and Heritage. Which, again, is a difference in turn for most of Europe, is this tradition of private philanthropy for these foundations, for foundations in general, and for the universities. So, but for the most part, it's not public money. It's private money. Now, so the sources of policy advice. Someone mentioned a few moments ago, that we need to consider the differences among these types of policy advisors. So, yes, we do. Here they are. At least a reasonable list thereof. So, first of all, and what I've been spending most of the time talking about is the civil service. And that's to some extent whom Wildowski was talking about when he was talking about speaking truth to power. That presumably the permanent career civil service has more of an opportunity to speak truth to power than anyone else. They've got a job. Their career, presumably can't be dismissed for political reasons. So hence they should be the ones who are the most fearless in what they say to their political masters. Now often that isn't the case, because they want to get along as well. So their evaluations from their ministers will affect their careers. They may get sent to some undesirable post in Cutbank, Montana, or some odd place like that. So their careers can be affected, but at least they still have a career. But also then, the nature of the civil service affects their capacity to be policy advisors. To that basic point I raised yesterday about generalist versus specialist careers. Now, the specialist, presumably, is the better policy advisor. He or she who's been brought in for a particular, spent a whole career in one ministry, one policy area, often has education in that policy area, is everything else being equal, going to be a better policy advisor than as a generalist, someone who's got a generalist degree in the classic education for the British Civil Service was classics, going back to Northcote Trevelyan. The notion being that, in fact, Northcote Trevelyan said that anyone who can learn Latin and Greek can learn anything. And so the best indication of brains is mastery of the classics. In fact, they wanted them to learn Cherokee, which is harder. But anyway, whereas the other model is, and then the other model of generalists are lawyers. So a lot of European civil service systems are composed of lawyers. Now, certainly the law is an element of the job of the civil servant, but doesn't have the substance of many policy areas. It's how to make them work, perhaps, within the legal framework, but not that much substance. So lawyers are generalists in policy terms. So again, the nature of the civil service does matter in terms of how effective they're going to be as policy advisors. And then there's the point I made a moment ago. There's this notion that, again, that the transmittal then is one-on-one. So that a lot of the effectiveness of policy advice depends upon the personal relationship between the advisor and the advisee. The advisor, the civil servant, is not only usually carrying what he or she knows, often is carrying the work for the whole department. But that, no matter how good that work is, it's not going to make much difference if the minister won't listen. If the minister thinks that the civil servant is a twit or an idiot or whatever, or is more importantly untrustworthy, then it's not going to matter a lot. So then the question becomes, in part, then, so that most of the time so the ethos has been that we want to depoliticize career civil service. But the question then really is very real: is how effective can that career depoliticized civil service be in the political world? If the minister doesn't trust the advice, doesn't think that the minister is really the civil servant is really on the team, then how much attention are they likely to give? Yeah.
In this sense, can you make a differentiation between experts and advisors? Yeah,
sure. Yeah, exactly. But typically, the experts are on tap, but not on top. So the experts are used, but then it has to be channeled through the process. The experts rarely get to the minister.
But does it coincide with general specialists?
In part, yeah. Now, so I was going to say, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. Anyway, it'll come back, I hope. And then the final point is a lot of the reforms in administration that I mentioned and had talked about, I think, in part 2, have tended to devalue the role of the civil servant as policy advisor. So that the hero now in the civil service is not the policy advisor, it's the manager. Somebody who runs programs, implements programs. Whereas the policy advice then has gotten to be separate largely from the career civil service, or increasingly separate from the career civil service. So, in addition to the civil service, there are lots of other ways that policy advice comes about. First of all, for executives, for ministers and prime ministers. Advisory committees. I mentioned yesterday that most ministers, most ministries have advisory committees that presumably that contain experts, that contain representatives of stakeholders, who themselves often are expert. And they're not just representing interests. Part of the way in which stakeholders can be effective is bringing information to the table along with opinion. So that the good stakeholder then is not just there advocating, they're there advocating with data, with information, with some knowledge. Secondly, executives build in often specialized advisory bodies. Things like, in the example there, Council of Economic Advisors in the U.S. So the president has on tap his CEA, 7 very good economists there to advise the president. They're the ones that Harry wanted to be one-armed because they kept giving him the contradictory advice. Now, legislatures also engage in policy analysis. Now, the less so in parliamentary systems than in presidential systems. So that legislatures in parliamentary governments tend, everything else being equal, to be less effective policy analytic bodies. That having been said, there are some good cases that contradict that. The U.S., of course, but the House of Lords committees in Britain, particularly the House of Lords Committee on Science, has been a real model of policy advice. So much of British science policy for the last 25 years actually has come out of the House of Lords Committee on Science. And being Lords, they don't have to stand for election. They've got all the time in the world. And for a variety of accidents, some people who in fact were fairly knowledgeable scientists came into the House of Lords and then established this tradition. But the use of committees and permanent committees as mechanisms for policy advice. Another good example is Finland. The Finnish committees, particularly the Committee on the Future, is an excellent case of a legislative committee that does very, very good policy analysis. Essentially what they're trying to do is figure out right now where Finland's going to be in the year 2050 and prepare themselves for it. Now, this is obviously our heroic sort of forecasting efforts. But at the same time, it's the use of the legislative power, legislative staffs, to try to deal with these policy analytic issues, deal with forecasting, deal with the future. Likewise, pardon the spelling error there, legislatures also have some policy analytic capacity and specialized structures, usually in accounting organizations. So most government accounting structures have shifted from being green eye shade accountants, i.e. simply looking at the numbers, to being policy analytic accountants. So that they ask the question, not only was the money spent legally, but was the money spent in the most effective manner possible? So, this began in two places. It began in part with the Dutch accounting office and with the U.S. accounting office. So Frans Leuven in the Netherlands was one of the grand old men in this movement. But the GAO in the United States now is very good at this as well. So most of if you ever have insomnia, you can get on the GAO website and read all the reports you want to read about government policy. But they're always phrased in a question. That is, did the Department of Defense do this the best way? Whatever this was, procurement of fighter planes or whatever. So it's always this analytic question about how to spend the money the best way, how to make the system the most effective. And these folks are answering not to the President, these answer to Congress. And again, give Congress the capacity on their own to be effective in policy terms. You can even use judicial. Yeah.
Ask one question.
Of course.
I have heard that every member of Congress and of Senate as well has at least 20 advisors, which are. But my question is: are they paid by the Congress, by the budget of the Congress, or by privates?
Okay, they're
most of them are with some very narrow specialization, let's say doctorate, etc.
Well, you're glorifying it a bit. So the average member of Congress has about 20, 25 staff. Average senator has about 50 now. And some, like Ted Kennedy, have about 100. But lots of a good portion of these are publicly funded. Some of them are privately funded, particularly for people like Kennedy. But a lot of them these are not just policy advisors. They are also people who are back in the constituency, who are essentially dealing with citizens and with the demands of citizens. So each congressman will have an office in his or her constituency, and that office does mostly citizen complaints. So that, for example, if I'm a veteran and I'm supposed to get veterans benefits and the check doesn't come this month, I'll call the VA once, then I'll call my congressman. And so they spend a lot of their staff time dealing with those types of complaints. And the argument is, this is the way they get reelected. Now, every time you take a policy stand, you make enemies. But when you serve your constituency, both in terms of these personal complaints and in terms of getting pork barrel money, money for post offices, roads, whatever, so congressmen invest a lot of their staff time and way too much of their own personal time in this constituency service. There are some experts on the staff. Typically, the staff, particularly the Washington office, is organized with an AA, administrative assistant, and an LA, a legislative assistant. And the legislative assistant organizes essentially the policy work. Okay? Now, one can also, you think about using judicial mechanisms for policy analysis. This isn't what one usually thinks about with the judiciary. But it is. But to some extent, one can do this. Example: public inquiries in the United Kingdom. So these are judicial exercises. For example, King's Cross. About 10 years ago, there was this major fire at the King's Cross underground station, underneath the train station. Something like 60 people, I think we heard, or 16 or 20 killed. Then so there was a judicial inquiry into the disaster. And from that inquiry came essentially lots of changes in fire safety and safety on the underground. So this was using then essentially a judicial inquiry, essentially an inquiry into wrongful death, as a means then of policy analysis. So one can then use the judiciary as a back door for policy analysis. The amici briefs in the U.S. and other Anglo-Saxon systems, amici is the plural, singular, amicus curiae, friend of the court. So in major court cases, not only do the protagonists put in briefs, but amici, the friends, quote unquote, are allowed to put in briefs. Example. And the greatest example is Brown versus Board of Education, which was the major desegregation case in 1954. So that the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had an extraordinarily powerful amicus brief on the effects of segregation on children, and was cited by the majority or the unanimous opinion as being one of the major pieces of evidence. And it was largely sociological evidence, sociological and psychological evidence that the NAACP put into the brief. So then again, using the court system, and in this case the briefing system, as a means for policy analysis. So, and remember that courts make policy as well. We don't usually think about it, but particularly when in systems of judicial review, courts make policy. So in the European Union, the European Court of Justice makes policy. They won't say that they do it, but they do. I mean, Cassis de Dijon and so forth is sort of crucial to, and some of the other court cases.
It's a very famous case, Cassis de Dijon.
So these types of court cases then have been crucial to the progress of the Union. It's policy, but it simply happens to be made in quite a different way. Okay, then there are also special policy making or policy analytic, policy advisory types of bodies. The Dutch Scientific Policy Council is probably the best example. An organization in Dutch government whose job it is to deal with big policy issues. So the government gives them a mandate and tasks them to provide advice, particularly on really big issues, but sometimes for relatively small issues as well. Have the money to hire policy advisors, experts, to help government make policy. Royal commissions in the Scandinavian countries, the SOU and NOU systems, my Swedish isn't very good, but they usually come out as SOUs. These are commissions appointed by government to deal with a major policy change, who can bring in the expertise, bring in stakeholders, often have quite a long period of time, come out with policy recommendations for government. And continental systems, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, among others, have a system of expertises where they invite an expert to write a policy document for government, usually academics, way of subsidizing salaries.
And speaking of Germany,
yeah,
like a small remark.
Of course.
They have such a body which is to each minister called Wissenschaftliches Beirat, so
yeah.
the council of the scientists, and which are nominated. They are not by them, but they are partially nominated by different bodies in order to secure that they are independent minister. They can issue, not only on the right, but issue their opinion on the issues which are concerning the minister's policy. And that in their view is very important part of the checks and balances system in order to secure that the minister is doing the most right thing and not influencing his councillors politically.
Okay, Kaka?
Can I have a question? What's the difference between the special policy analytic bodies and the bodies as executive? When both are
well, they are, but one tends to be answering directly to the government. The other is simply formed by the government, and then it's largely independent. So it's really a question of the degree of independence. Okay, political parties also provide a certain amount of policy analysis. They have often have their own research arms, have party foundations, and also frequently provide policy advisors to ministers and members of cabinet. So that there may be a sort of a shadow civil service of party members who provide advice to the minister. Interest groups, again, advocacy is great, ideas are great, but it helps when those ideas are backed up with some solid data and solid information. So the interest group universe often is a source of lots of policy analysis. It's biased, but at least you know it's biased. And the job then is often for the civil servant advisor is to sift through all the bias and come up with something to hand to the minister. So the job for the policy advisor often is a sifting job, as well as coming up with the research him or herself. Well, in fact, often the problem is overload, too much data, rather than not enough, and having to pick and choose among it. And then we've talked about think tanks. The final thing, that was quick, wasn't it? The final thing I want to talk about is structuring advice. the reason I had you read the reading I gave there from a real golden oldie from Alex George was the question then about how do you structure advice? And his notion was one of multiple advocacy. That instead of having some sort of simple hierarchical structure for advice, of having a more complex, open advice. So I just went through thinking about how various American presidents have structured their advice systems. So FDR had his so-called kitchen cabinet, Harry Hopkins and a few other people, friends, longtime political associates, whom he relied upon. But then he also used spies. That is, he had friends that he would place way down in the bottom of lots of organizations. So people who were who thought they were very talented and high-powered would wind up with very low-level jobs. But their task really was to let the president know what was happening. So he could call them up late at night and say, what's really going on there? So he developed essentially an alternative communication system of advice. Eisenhower, military background, yeah.
But did people know that these were good friends? Or
of course, yeah. It was fairly obvious.
Yeah, but maybe they would hide information or
working for the president. But it's hard to hide so much if you're... Eisenhower, military background, wanted everything in terms of policy on one piece of paper, one side, double-spaced. And so he wanted essentially as a decision memo. That is, this is our advice, take it or not. This is what we recommend. Then he would say yes or no. Sort of military background, that's how he ran the presidency. That's how he made policy. And according to Fred Greenstein, he actually did a very good job. But that was his style. JFK had his brain trust, the Harvard types of McNamara and Sergeant Shriver, all the guys down there from Harvard who talk like that. But essentially he had another kitchen cabinet, but what came to be known as the best and brightest, who gave us Vietnam. If you haven't seen the movie on McNamara, Fog of War, it is a fantastic movie, actually a wonderful movie about policy advice. It's interviews with McNamara and his sort of principles about policy. Spectacular. I want to use it when I teach, the next time I teach public policy. So you really should see it. Gerald Ford, Jerry Ford had the reputation of being one of our dumbest presidents. Lyndon Johnson said he played football too long without a helmet. But Ford was interesting in the extent that he wanted what Alexander George called for. Ford wanted multiple advocacy. So Ford would have all the advisors with different opinions come into the Oval Office and argue out in front of him, sometime for hours, on policy. Then he would decide. So he was really living out what Alexander George was talking about, this multiple advocacy. And not wanting, so the antithesis of Eisenhower, who wanted everything in these very brief memos. Reagan worked with what he called a visceral computer. That is, he knew what was right in his bones, in his guts. And then George W. uses comic books. No, I had to put that up there. I was going to pay political statement. Now, you can think about think about your own prime ministers, your own administrators. You'll probably find some of these same types of ways of thinking about policy. But the important point out of all this, the reason I did it is not just to go through American presidents, but to think about the ways in which different people can structure policy advice, make it work. So to some extent it's a matter of personality. People have higher tolerances for diversity, higher tolerances for argument than do others. Eisenhower had 0 tolerance for that. Jerry Ford had a great deal of tolerance for it. So the structuring of advice is important. And I think everything else being equal, so George's comments about multiple adequacy are very well taken. So part of the problem always is groupthink. Part of the problem always in policy advice is coming up with too readily with one solution for complex problems and reinforcing that solution rather than thinking about the alternatives. Well, it's that time. So, we got questions to end with?